Glass and rain and a screen that felt like a rib breaking. Elena Sorrento's world folded inward in the time it took the cafe door to implode. Her hand, still clutching a ceramic cup that had once burned with someone else's morning, filled with grit and hot, unfamiliar light. She tasted copper, then the acrid tang of smoke, then the sudden, impossible stillness inside her chest as the building's world shifted and became rubble. Someone shouted her name. Someone screamed for help. She tried to move and discovered she had no idea which part of her was still hers. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Luca Bellamy had never thought of himself as brave. He had thought of himself as careful, as someone who could navigate life by the narrow rules someone else had written for him. A promise to his mother, a schedule of shifts, an honest enough paycheck that kept his sister fed and the rent paid. He had not planned to become anyone's hero. Yet there he was, rain slicking his hair, boots sinking into the glass and coffee-sodden carpet, hauling a woman out of the wreckage as if she were a sack of flour, and feeling the odd, ridiculous surge of something like rightness. Like this was the thing he'd been small and steady enough to do his whole life without ever pretending it mattered. She smelled of expensive perfume and blood. Up close, Luca could see the angles of her face, sharp, practiced, a face used to being observed and never tenderly looked at. She blinked at him as if shocked awake from a memory that wasn't his. And when she tried to speak, it came out as a brittle laugh that broke on the ash in her mouth. "Get me away," she said. Her voice was low, the kind of thing that could order deals and people, and the way she said those words turned the air around them taut. Luca looked at the van, his van, scratched and dependable, a little warhorse that had carried packages and takeout and his own small, bruised dignity across the city for years. He could have called the ambulance. He could have handed her off. Instead, he found his fingers on her forearm, steadying. "In my van. Come on." She let him, like a kingpin who had finally lowered her guard to a delivery boy's hands. She was lighter than she looked, and when he eased her into the seat, she leaned back, breathing in fast, as if the oxygen itself might betray her. The rain crawled along the van windows, and the engine hummed. The city around them smelled of wet asphalt and emergency smoke. Elena's eyes found his in the dim light, and for a moment, the riot of the world outside didn't matter so much as the tiny, human, precise shock of being seen by someone who hadn't stepped away. She had a reputation that carved silence into rooms. Widow, matriarch, the woman who inherited a crown she never wanted. Men bowed when she walked into spaces because they knew fear was a coin. Women stepped aside because rumor had teeth. That reputation had kept people at a careful distance for years. Luca, in his plain jacket and tired hands, didn't step away. He was a flat, honest person who smelled faintly of onions and engine oil and the kind of unfiltered sincerity that was rare and dangerous to someone like her. "What's your name?" he asked, because it was the simplest thing to ask someone you had put into your van and whose life might still be ticking. It was also a way of extending the very small mercy of not treating her like an object of spectacle. "Elena," she said. Her hand found the seatbelt across her chest and held it like a talisman. Sorrentino. Recognition came for Luca in a slow, unwelcome way. The Sorrentino name had been in every headline, in quiet, dark conversations behind shuttered doors. It meant careful eyes and older loyalties and deaths that did not die easily. He had delivered sandwiches and envelopes and once a vintage watch to an address that was probably theirs, and for a second he felt like an insect who had landed on a lioness's paw. "You're hurt," he said, because he didn't know what else to do. He could see the reddened handprints on her blouse, the fine dust of brick across her hair, the tremor in her jaw when she tried to form words she wasn't sure she wanted to use. She laughed, a smaller sound now. "Hurt is a polite word," she said. She leaned forward, one hand to her chest as if to reassemble the pieces. Her other hand moved and brushed his palm, ash to ash, then froze. "Thank you." Luca shrugged. He didn't say that he'd been terrified. He didn't say that the interior of the van had felt like a sanctuary he'd never had before, or that when her fingers touched his skin, he felt something unnamed sink into the part of him that lived with spreadsheets of pennies and lists of chores. He simply drove, the wipers keeping a slow, even rhythm, the engine a steady, improbable heartbeat. They drove until the sirens diminished behind them, and the city became a skeleton of streetlights and shut shop windows. Elena watched the passing lights with a kind of detached curiosity he couldn't immediately read. When they stopped at a long light, she turned to him, eyes a story of grief and calculation. "Take me somewhere safe," she said, "not a hospital." "Why not a hospital?" Luca asked. "Because hospitals were what you went to when your world was flattening into rubble, and there were pieces of it you couldn't identify." She smiled then, and even in the dark, that smile was dangerous, beautiful, and fatal. "Because they will ask questions, and the wrong people will find me. Because there are things blood cannot explain, and men who take explanations as currency. Because I don't want to be on a gurney talking to some nurse about my brother and my husband's funeral. I want a place where I can think." Luca thought of his sister, May, curled up on the couch at home, waiting for supper and for the return of the man who paid the bills and could repair a leaky sink. He thought of the promise to his mother that he would keep their life small and safe and correct. He didn't say anything. He knew what it was to be asked to carry someone else's life. He also knew what it felt like to be too small for the weight. "I can take you to my sister's place," he said slowly, "or my flat. It's not much, but it's dry, and I can call." "No," Elena said sharply, a single chord of command. "You will shelter me. You will not speak to anyone about me. You will not call the police. You will drive. And you will not try to make money off me. No interviews, no pictures." The list read like a bargain, and Luca felt the old, familiar instinct to diagram the way life might be rearranged by small concessions. He wanted to object, to ask questions about who would come for her, about why anyone would target a woman whose husband had been a figure of such menace. But he also felt, for the first time that night, the iron ring of responsibility tighten around him in a different shape. The responsibility not only to his sister, but to the humanity that asked nothing of him except shelter. "Why me?" he asked, because the question was sharp and honest and withheld a tremor of fear. Had he saved a ghost? Had he salvaged a danger that would now hang over them both like a noose? She watched him for a long moment, the rain streaking down the glass like tears she refused. "Because you did not look at me as a headline," she said quietly. "Because you moved without asking what I could give you in return. Because sometimes, Luca Bellamy, the only people who will help a woman like me are those who do not know what we cost." He felt the cold of his name on her tongue like something intimate and exposed. He didn't tell her that he had never told anyone his full name. In his life, names had been small shields against the world. For Elena, names were a ledger. The van cut into a rainy, quiet neighborhood where the buildings kept their secrets behind frosted glass. Luca drove past people rushing under umbrellas and a child with a neon backpack, the surreal normalcy of other lives, a pressure against the rupture he'd just lived through. He found a narrow, tired apartment building where he had paid rent for 3 years and which his landlord tolerated because Luca had always been the one to fix pipes in exchange for a delayed payment. He parked on the street and turned the engine off. The world became the hum of rain and Elena's measured breathing. He helped her through the door. Inside, his flat smelled of coffee and the faint bleach of an apartment someone tried to keep from decaying. He had one bedroom, a couch that had long ago accepted the imprint of a life lived sideways, and a kitchen where his sister kept mismatched mugs. It was small and honest, the kind of place you could not hide big things in. Elena looked around like a woman scanning territory, her gaze sharp and precise. "This is fine," she said at last. "Listen, I do not have time for explanations, and I do not want an escort who will parlay my misfortunes for attention. I need a place to lay low. I can pay you. Pay me," Luca cut in. The words sounded foreign in his own mouth when it came from hers. He thought of the ledger in his head: rent, food, May's schoolbooks. He thought of how much his life could change if a Sorrentino wanted his rent money. "You may not understand what it is to be me," Elena said softly. And for the first time, something under the armor cracked enough that the hurt showed. "I didn't choose any of this. I buried a husband in a coffin I did not build. I inherited a palace of obligations I never wanted. There are things in that palace that would outlive me if I left them unattended. I am trying to give someone the one clean thing I still can." And then she said it, like a small, impossible prayer that threw everything they'd both been taught into a furnace of contradiction. "I want a child from you." The words fell, and the room held them like an animal might hold a bone between its paws. Luca heard the absurdity first, and then the raw need underlying it, like a pulse that refused to be quiet. He wanted to laugh at the theatrical cruelty of it, Mafia widow asking a delivery boy for a legacy, but he only felt the sudden, sharp drop of his stomach. "A child?" he repeated, because language needed to keep up with a world that had already shattered once that night. "Why me?" "Because you are invisible enough that a child with your name might be allowed a life that doesn't carry the taste of my family's sins," Elena said. Her voice was not pleading, it was businesslike, almost clinical. "Because I can't trust the men who say they will protect me. They will use a child as a bargaining chip the minute I step back. I need someone who isn't marked. I need someone who can give me a child that will stand apart from the deaths of Sorrentino blood." Luca's throat tightened. He thought of May's face, how small her worries could be, how much the promise to keep their life safe had shaped every corner of his being. To accept would be to open a door to danger he'd sworn never to enter. To refuse would be to leave a woman who had been blown into pieces to stitch herself alone. He didn't know anything about being a father beyond a boyhood of babysitting neighborhood kids and a deep, instinctual tenderness for his sister. He had never imagined a child with a woman like Elena. Her life was carved of marble and obsidian. His was clay and tape and earnest, clumsy hope. Outside, rain stitched the night into a blur. Inside, the fragile newness of their quiet breathed between them. Elena watched him, and Luca watched her, and the room contained the weight of a choice neither of them could yet make. He stared at the ceiling as if answers might be taped there, watched the plaster swallow the light and the memory of sirens. The absurdity of Elena's request had not diminished with time. If anything, it had grown teeth. A child, his child, meant ledger lines that read like danger. It meant a tether into a family whose name opened doors to threats, to old men who measured people in usefulness, and to children who grew up taught to pay back sins they never committed. "You're asking me to be a," Luca began, searching for the right word, the one that would not make everything sound like a transaction. He couldn't land on one that matched her voice, the way she'd said it, not as a demand, but as a desperate, exact plan. "A father in name only? What do you want from me exactly?" Elena's fingers tapped the armrest with a quiet punctuation. "A child," she said, like repeating it would make its edges less jagged. "A life that cannot be used against me, because it will not bear the Sorrentino mark. I can provide protection. I can pay for things you and your sister may never need to think about. I can make sure you are safe. In return, you give me a child. You agree to a name change, perhaps to an anonymity I can help manage." She spoke like a woman who had negotiated marriage contracts in rooms where men smoked and calculated futures with ledgers. But when she said, "I can make sure you are safe," the words were softer, rawer. There was an undertow in them, fear shaped into an offering. Luca thought of safety. He thought of the hours he had sat up at night with Maze's small hand tucked into his, whispering away the monsters they couldn't afford. Safety had been the scaffolding of his life. It had been his vow to his dead mother that he would not let their world tip into the chaos that had taken her away. To accept Elena's bargain was to step into a storm that could swallow that vow. "And you want this?" he said, finally. "Because you think if the child has my name, people won't—" He couldn't finish. Voices trailed off in his mind, images of men making offers bent on a child like vultures. He felt suddenly stripped bare of eloquence. "Yes," Elena said, simply, "because men will not take a boy who looks like a Bellamy as anything but a Bellamy. They will not use him as leverage the way they will use a Sorrentino child." Her hands clenched and unclenched. "Because I've watched this business fold men into reasons to be killed and children into bargaining tables. I want to give whatever of me is human a chance. I want something I can die for without thinking of ledgers." Something soft and wild uncoiled in Luca at the edges of her confession. He had always believed in sacrifice, in small, dutiful acts that kept a life from fraying. But this was a sacrifice layered with a woman's grief. It was a demand that asked him to give not just his flesh, but his future. He imagined waking in 10 years to a child with his stubborn jaw, Elena's eyes like storm-lashed glass, and the world coming to tap that child's shoulder with a collection notice. How do you even—" he began, then realized equally raw honesty was required. "You want me to father your child, but you don't love me. You barely know me. Why me, and not some anonymous donor? Why choose me?" Elena's laugh was a small, sharp thing that flurried the dust motes in the lamp's light. "Because anonymity is a lie in my life. Every anonymous favor I have given has had an invoice attached to it, signed with a name and a promise. A man inside my circles would never be able to pretend not to know me. He would be tracked, he would be used. You are ordinary enough to disappear if I make the right arrangements. You look like the city. You smell like the city. You won't be expected to be anything but what you are." He flinched at the phrase arrangements. It sounded like knives and ledgers and men whose loyalty could be bought with silence. He wanted to ask about risks, about what it would mean if those arrangements failed, but he didn't. Instead, he found his hand moving, slowly, to the cup holder, to the ghost of an old habit. He had to hear more until he could measure this request against everything he had promised his life. "How long would this last?" he asked. "How do we keep—" "Until the child is old enough to choose," Elena said before he could finish. "We will make a paper trail. We will move the records. I will pay for genetic papers that show no connection if it becomes necessary. I have friends in institutions, people with the skill to make a face in the world uncomplicated. I can protect you. I will hire a bodyguard for a season. I will send money to your sister under a name you'll recognize. I will vanish if I must, but I will not leave a child vulnerable to my enemies. That is the trade. There was a clarity in her offer that made it feel less like a plea and more like a contract forged in the quiet of someone desperate to protect a piece of their soul. Luca could imagine signatures, lawyers, wait lists, clinics, and the sterile smell of hospital corridors. He could imagine nights he might be required to be in a safe house, days he might have to hand his phone to an invisible ledger keeper and hope they didn't call May. He could imagine, too, the money. It would be more than he'd ever seen, more than enough for May's schooling, for a deposit on a better flat, for doctor's bills, and a life where small catastrophes could be tidied with cash instead of panic. Why would you trust me with... He stopped himself. Trust was not a word that sat comfortably with someone who lived in a world where trust had teeth. Nevertheless, he wanted to find out if Alina's fierce independence had room for faith. "Because you saved me," she said. Her voice thinned, becoming small and unmade around the center of the confession. "Because I expected you to look away and you didn't. Because I am tired of being kept alive only to be weaponized by men who believe blood makes their property. I want to create something that is mine without the ledger's ink. I want to have a single life I can love untransactionally." Lucas' stomach folded under the weight of it. He had not thought of Elena as somebody who could want anything without calculating its utility. He had thought her immaculate grief was a sculpted thing, smooth and unyielding. But there, in his cramped living room, she revealed a hunger that got under her jaw like a splinter, the need to carve any form of softness into her world before the world took that away. The first line of defense Luca had always used when the world asked too much was to say no. It had kept him small and safe. He told himself no now, and the word tasted like iron. He told himself no because he loved May and wanted a life stitched of predictability. He told himself no because he had promised his mother, and the promise was a map he had never been willing to deviate from. He told himself no because he feared becoming collateral to a grief so large it would swallow his own small life. But Elena had stepped into the wreckage of her cafe and asked for a child as if she had a right to that softness, and her exhaustion made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. He thought of the nights he'd held May when the thunder came, and the little girl had whispered that monsters didn't take people who loved them. He thought of the way Elena's hands had trembled in his earlier touch. He thought of the way grief etches itself into bones and extends its tendrils into the lives of everyone within reach. Could he refuse a woman who had been reduced to an urgent domestic prayer? "What about my sister?" he asked, because even in the whirls of new desire that Elena's words stirred, his sense of duty remained a braided cord in his chest. What happens if they come for me? What happens if they come for her? Elena's face cooled, the way cut marble looks when a sculptor puts the tool down and steps back. "If anyone comes for your family, it will be because they know a bargain has been made. I will make sure they don't." She leaned forward, hands flat on her knees, suddenly ordinary and brittle. "You must understand, this is not a guarantee in the way you think. People die in my world, but I will use every resource available to ensure innocence around this child. There are old loyalties that will buy you time, and I will pay for more." It was a promise and an admission of the limits of promises both. She could not ensure absolute safety because the world that had shaped her had rules that refused to be rewritten. There were debts and bargains and men with memory longer than their mercy. That admission made Lucas's impulse to close every door sudden and sharp. Yet the offering of money, safety, and something like a new beginning glinted like a lighthouse in a fog he did not want to navigate alone. He pictured May again, the way she would fold into the safety of a new life if things changed, the way her small fingers would learn new rhythms. He imagined a school with trees, with music classes, and teachers who didn't ask names that carried shipwrecks. He imagined giving his sister something more than careful thrift stitched together with hope. He imagined, too, the child he might father, a small person with a stubborn jaw, with Elena's storm-dark eyes and his own laugh. The thought unclenched something in him he had not known had been bound, a sudden, peculiar tenderness for a life not yet begun. How do we— He wiped his palms on his jeans, the old nervousness returning. How do we start? Are we talking medically? Are we— Elena's hand reached across the small space between them and rested on his knee. Her touch was not like the brief, transactional grazing of earlier. It was intentional, human, the kind of contact that said, "I need you here in this exact way. We will do it in whatever way you are willing. There are clinics, there are legal papers. I will pay. We will take the necessary steps so the child is protected from the moment of their first breath." Luca swallowed. Logistics made the possibility feel tethered to earth. They lowered the fevered edges of it enough to be navigable. "And if I say no?" he asked, not because he was ready to refuse, but because he needed to know what space denial would create between them. Elena's eyes closed for a breath. She looked 17 for a second, less a matriarch and more a woman who had had much taken and had learned to calculate the cost of everything. When she opened them, they were the same tempered steel, tempered by a flicker of something like regret. "Then I will go back into the world and try to keep whatever is left of me safe without planting something immaculate in it. I will do what I can. Many would call me foolish." Her voice scraped the inside of her throat. "You will not be harmed for saying no, but I will mourn the loss of a thing I could not buy by any other means." The mercy in her words made the decision an act of agency rather than coercion. No one had ever offered him that kind of gentle ultimatum. Choose and keep your life. The world had taught him to be grateful for crumbs. Elena Sorrento, woman of danger and carved grief, had placed both an impossible offer and an impossible allowance on his table. Luca thought of the rain outside, of the way the city cleaned itself and left truth like debris in gutters. He thought of the van and the way his hands had steadied hers on a street wet with other people's lives. He thought of the smallness of his world and of the way a child, any child, could become the axis around which future choices spun. "Let me think," he said at last, because he needed time to assemble the shape of what would become a life, one that wasn't just about ledger lines and safety, but about waking up to someone's small breathing and feeling an unfamiliar, fierce love. Elena's fingers didn't leave his knee. "Think fast," she said, with a whisper of humor that broke the tension. And for a luminous second, she looked less like a figure of industry and more like a person who needed a cradle of ordinary care. Outside, the rain eased into a drowse. Inside, their breath and the thin lamplight kept watch over the new, dangerous possibility that had slid between two very different people and refused to be dismissed. The thought of a child, absurd and holy, had planted itself like a seed in a garden neither of them had planned. The weight of that seed made the room feel both terrifying and full of a strange, aching promise. The knock on Luca's door was not the knock of a neighbor with cake or a landlord with a notice. It was the kind of knock that arrived in 3 hard taps, then a dragged pause, as if whoever knelt outside his threshold was rehearsing what part of the world they intended to break. He opened to the hallway light and found not a man in a suit, but one of Elena's shadows, Antonio, a broad-shouldered enforcer who smelled of tobacco and clean violence. His face was careful when it saw Luca, which meant his voice would not be. "We have news," Antonio said. There was a practiced softness beneath the words, a softness designed to break people in a civilized manner. May Bellamy has been taken. Luca's knees folded like cheap chairs. The kitchen tile pressed into the backs of his calves as if to restrain him from collapsing to the floor. For a moment, the world narrowed to one precise, impossible detail. May. His sister with the braid that never obeyed him, with the homework that looked like a homework-shaped lily, with the laughter that patched holes in his days. May had been taken. Where? The question was useless. He knew it. But the sound of it was a bridge over which panic could not cross. Antonio's jaw moved. They left a note. He held out a scrap. Luca's hand took it as if retrieving something heavy from water. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and the antiseptic of offices that made deals. The handwriting was not Sorrentino, not the angular script of Elena's inner circle, but the message carried an old brutality. If you want her back, you help Elena produce what she claims to want, or the child is collateral. Luca felt as though his rib cage had been taken and rubbed raw. Collateral. The word tore down the rooms in his mind where he'd been building ordinary, careful futures. He thought of Elena's calm voice, of the offer like a contract set into his life not long before. He thought of protection promised. He thought, sick and immediate, of leverage. She said she would protect my sister, Luca managed. His voice was thin. She promised. She will buy her back, Antonio said automatically. But we need conditions, help. There are complications. He did not say the business of mafias was never simple. He did not say that anyone who thought they could buy safety in a world of debts had to understand the cost. Luca wanted to grab Antonio's lapels and shake every word out of him. He wanted to run into the night and tear the city apart with his bare hands to find May and drag her molecules back together. Instead, he sat on the kitchen counter and let the paper cut his palm. When Elena arrived, it was like a second storm had walked in. She came with a veil of people, a lawyer who smelled of cloves, a woman in a headscarf who kept her voice low and her eyes feral. Her hands were steadier than the night she'd first climbed into Luca's van, but the stillness of her hands did not mean the inside of her was unmoved. Luca watched her and felt the raw, new awareness. He was not the only person who could break under grief. She, too, could be undone. "You said you would never use my family as leverage," he said before he could stop himself. The accusation cut like a blade. It was more than words. It was a demand for the truth that had been kept from him. Elena's mouth pressed into a hard line. "I didn't," she snapped. Her voice flared and then was blade calm again. "They took her because they found a ledger that indicated you were under my protection. They assumed it was a guarantee you would not run." He stared at her. A ledger? Elena's lawyer moved forward with an efficient shuffle and placed a laptop on Luca's coffee table. The screen displayed numbers, transactions, a tidy accounting of payments. Luca leaned in, the rooms of his life reconfiguring with each line. Monthly transfers to a school with a name that hid the truth, a rent deposit, a medical account in a separate jurisdiction, payments he had thought had appeared out of nowhere. Each line was a ripple in his life he had never questioned. He realized with a hollowing motion that Elena had already begun to make his life safer in ways he hadn't consented to. Money routed quietly through blind trusts, people positioned in the background to mend small catastrophes before they could hurt him or May. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. The question was less about money and more about agency. He had been given a life rearranged without being asked. It felt like love, and it felt like ownership in one impossible package. Elena looked at him as if she had been burned. "Because you would have refused," she said. "Because if you knew how many hands would be on you, you would have left and nothing would have mattered again. I could not risk that." Lucas' laugh was broken. "So you made choices for me," he said. "You assumed what I would do. You turned my life into a ledger and didn't ask if I wanted the bookkeeping." Silence sat like a hot stone between them. Elena should have been patient. She had been negotiating with men who wore patience like armor for years, but something inside her snapped. "Do you think this has been easy?" she asked. "Do you think I like being the woman who makes others' lives for them so they survive? I am doing everything I can." "Everything you can" sounded like a justification and a threat. For the first time in days, Lucas saw the seams of Elena's armor reveal not controlled power, but a desperate, raw fear. He had been shielding himself under the comfort of her resources without understanding that those same resources were not gifts. They were attachments, clamps that would never let him go. He thought of May curled up on the couch the previous evening, of the way the girl's face relaxed when he hummed the wrong words to lull a storm away. He thought of every time he'd said yes to small, safe things, because the weight of promises had been easier to bear than the risk of saying no. He realized, with a cold uptick of fury, that Elena had not simply offered him protection. She had, in her way, decided what would be done in his name. It felt like being chosen and like being put on a leash at the same time. "Then why did they take her?" he asked. "If you have resources, why would anyone think they could take May from me?" Elena's hand trembled, and this time she did not hide it. "Because there are men who think anything connected to Sorrentino can be turned into a coin," she said. "Because someone inside my circle wanted to send a message. Because I did not erase every trace soon enough." Her honesty was a small spear through Lucas' torso. "Someone inside your circle?" he echoed. He had seen faces in news photos laugh like boys who didn't know the damage their toys could do. The idea that a betrayal had come from within her own world, someone who understood the cost of such cruelty, felt like a personal desecration. "Yes," Elena said. "Johnny. He believes he is owed for the old arrangements. He thinks a child is the perfect bargaining chip. He wanted to show the other families that even the matriarch cannot keep everything hidden." Johnny's name landed like a stone on water and sent ripples through Luca that reshaped everything. If betrayal was inside, then nothing was sacred. Men within Elena's inner chain, whom she had trusted to be loyal, had chosen leverage over loyalty. Luca felt the floor give beneath him. "You didn't stop him?" The words were brutal in their simplicity. "I tried," Elena said. "I tried to buy loyalty. I tried to patch old debts. But you cannot simply buy the loyalty of a man who believes his worth is tied to the violence he can mete out." She was suddenly smaller, not the implacable matriarch, but a woman who had been working a telescope to find a way out and found only closer storms. The first fracture opened not with violence, but with the quieter, crueler weapon. Luca thought of the ledger again, of the payments made without his knowledge, and he thought of promises broken by omission. He understood then that protection had a price he had not agreed to pay. The erosion of his autonomy and the binding of his family to a world he had sworn not to enter. "I can't be part of this," he said, and the words were not a defiant refusal, so much as an honest observation of what he could live with. "I won't have May grow up with a debt on her chest." Elena's face collapsed. "You won't hand her to me to keep safe?" The cruelty of her simple question made Luca feel like a traitor as much as it made him feel terrified. "I won't hand my sister over to your enemies, and I won't let her be used to manipulate me," he said. His voice was steadier than he felt, a small defense line raised with trembling hands. "If you want protection for May, do it with me in the room. No hidden accounts, no anonymous payments, no decisions made without me." For a moment, Elena's eyes flashed with the old iron temper. "You cannot begin to understand what I face," she said. "You are asking me to reveal every vulnerability I've hidden for a decade. You don't know what that does." "Then teach me," Lucas snapped. "Let me be part of it. Don't make choices for us." The demand was both tender and fierce, and it landed with a vulnerability Elena had not expected to be asked for. She had spent years taking ownership of a world to keep it from devouring the innocent. Being asked to open those vaults felt like handing over a weapon that could be used against her. She had always thought her way would be less messy, quiet transactions, controlled exposure. To let Luca in meant to risk him being dragged into the violence she had tried to contain. "Johnny will not stop," she said, finally. "And if we move too openly, they will take May and strike harder. If we move too secretly, you'll accuse me of making decisions without you. Either way, we lose something." The room shrank around the argument like the walls deciding to witness the fracture. Words made a canyon between them. Protection versus autonomy, safety versus freedom, the weighing of an innocent child's life against the preservation of a woman's fiercely held privacy. It was not a simple moral puzzle. It was the raw anatomy of two worlds colliding in the most intimate of spaces. When Luca left Elena's apartment that night, it was not with a polite parting. He left because the choice to stay had become entangled with compromises he could not reconcile with the small vows that had kept his world intact. He walked into the rain with his shoes making soft, ugly sounds on the pavement. The city, which had once felt like a high-risk but navigable map, now felt like a chessboard rigged with unknown players. Elena watched him go from the threshold and felt a hollowness unspool inside her, an old loneliness that had been stitched together with power. For the first time in years, she feared that the one life she wished to make untouchable would fall apart precisely because she had attempted to control everything. By dawn, the fracture had become a rupture. Luca sat on the bench by the river, watching ferries make their slow, indifferent crossings. He had no plan, save the ache of absence, the knowledge that love and danger had been braided into a single rope around his life. He tried to imagine returning to Elena, to the cramped apartment and the ledger and the impossible offer that had turned his quiet life into a battlefield of concessions. He tried to imagine May, safe and warm, and none the wiser to bargains and ledgers. The city moved on, utterly uninterested. Men in suits made deliveries. A child learned to read beneath a street lamp. A woman kissed a man on a stoop as if the world had no memory of the things that could devour an ordinary life. Luca felt smaller than he had ever felt, and more certain about one simple, devastating truth. This crisis would not be solved by secret accounts or quiet bargains. Someone would have to pay the cost of truth, and that cost might be written in lives. At noon, Elena found him again. She came with evidence, phone records, a file showing Giannis' recent transfers, a manila envelope with a single photograph of May taken from a distance, smiling in a park weeks ago. The photograph felt like a blow. It had no damage. It was simply proof that someone had been watching them all along. "I want you to be furious at me," she said when she found him, her voice raw with the admission. "I want you to hate me for what I did. But I need you to know everything. No more ledgers hidden behind your back." Luca took the photo and felt the world tilt again. He wanted to hurl it into the river and never think of it again. He wanted to tear Elena apart, not because he didn't care for her, but because he did, and the caring had become a hazard he could not afford. Their relationship, which had been born in the flaring instant of rescue, now lay open to infection. Secrets had been revealed, and fractures widened into canyons. Trust, Already a fragile thing between a woman who knew how to buy loyalty and a man who had promised small, honest things to his family, was now splintered into pieces too sharp for warm hands. "I can't do this if you keep deciding for me, Luca," said at last, the words a surrender and a plea. "If we're going to move together, we do it with doors open, Elena. I won't be saved without being asked to be a partner." She looked at him like someone reading a map written in a language she had almost forgotten. Then, with a slow, consenting nod, she said, "Then we will do it your way. We will find Johnny, we will find May, and we will burn the ledger. But you must know, we are stepping into an open field where bullets remember names." He thought of May's face, of the photograph like a small wound in his pocket. He thought of Elena's hands on his arm, not commanding now, but pleading. He realized that the attempt to make a child outside her blood had become entangled with the fight to keep his sister alive. He realized that whatever they chose next, it would be messy, dangerous, and irrevocable. They had both been forced to reveal things they would have preferred to bury. Elena's compromises, Luca's vow to his mother, the simplicity of ordinary futures crushed beneath ledger lines. The fractures were not healed, they were merely named. And in that naming, there was a small, dangerous chance that the two of them might, if they could survive what's to come, rebuild something real from the mess they'd made. But first, they had to bring May home, alive, whole, and untarnished. Outside the window, rain began again, each drop erasing footprints on the pavement. Inside, two people stood facing the knowledge that secrets had already done their worst and would do more unless they chose differently. The fracture pulsed, the choice to mend it or step away entirely hung between them like an unpronounced promise. They moved like people who had finally admitted to a shared wound and decided to stop pretending band-aids could bind it. Elena's plan, brutal, elegant, and threaded with risks, laid itself out on the coffee table in the small flat like a map to a grave. Luca read it while the rain stitched the city soft outside, and all the noises of ordinary life went on as if nothing could be broken by men who did not know how to be gentle. "We'll be loud," Elena said. "Johnny needs spectacle. He wants to humiliate me. He will take bait that looks like a prize. He will show his teeth where he thinks the matriarch cannot bite back." "We'll use the ledger," Luca said before he could stop himself. "We make it look like—" He swallowed. The idea of turning her old weapon into a trap made his hands tremble. "We make it look like you are giving them what they want in exchange for May. We offer a delivery, one that isn't a child, but appears to be proof of your cooperation. Then, when they come for the exchange, we take them." Elena watched him, the metal in her eyes softening in the way nighttime softens hard edges. "You think it's so simple," she said. "Johnny has men who believe themselves invulnerable. He'll expect a setup, and he'll have contingencies." "Then we out-contingency him," Luca said. "We make it public enough to attract them, but controlled. Police will look like an unfortunate coincidence. We will control the timeline. I can drive the truck. My van will be the decoy." She stood, suddenly close enough that the small staccato of her breath warmed his cheek. There were lines at her mouth from too many decisions made alone. There were shadows under her eyes from nights she had spent teaching herself to be merciful on a schedule. "You cannot put May in the van," she said quietly. "You cannot use your life like currency." "I know what I'm risking," he insisted, "but I'm not handing her over to be used." There was a long, tremulous moment where fear and veracity braided together in the space between them. Then Elena reached out and took his hand. Not the brief, perfunctory touch of a ruler paying respect to a subordinate, but the steady holding of two people who had chosen one another for reasons that made both of them ridiculously brave. "We will move at dusk," she said. "I will go to Johnny with a show. He will come with men. You will be the driver of my supposed transfer. You will be near. We will make sure May is hidden. When Johnny's men take the bait, we strike, fast, surgical. If I cannot bring them down in that moment, then I will do something I swore never to do. Elena, Luca began. I will surrender my name publicly for a day, she said. I will sign the ledger in public, in front of cameras. I will let them think they own me. But I will lead them into a trap where they meet people who will not let them leave. Her voice shook, a small human tremor behind the iron. I have men who will move at my signal, loyal ones. But loyalty in my world is a currency like any other. It can be bought, it can be sold. I will promise them a coin they cannot refuse if they help bring May home. Luca thought of the men who would take advantage of a surrendered matriarch and of the ugliness of the theater she planned to stage. He thought of the cost of bartering her identity like a scapegoat. He thought of his sister's small, trusting face and felt the world narrow into a tunnel he could not look away from. If you do this, he said slowly, each word sacred, you will put yourself directly in front of them. You'll be using your life as a shield. I have used others as shields before, she said, and there was a confession in that sentence that made doves of the stubborn things inside him. I will not do it again, not if you are beside me, not if I have to face what I did alone. He did not tell her he thought he could die that night and that the idea of it had not terrified him as much as it should have. Instead, he nodded. Then we do it together. No more ledgers behind doors, no more secrets. If we step into this field, we step in as partners. They rehearsed until the lamp in Luca's kitchen hummed soft and the coffee had turned to cold. They drew paths on a napkin, timed turns, memorized faces, and agreed on signals. Elena's people, those who still answered to the name Sorrentino for reasons of loyalty or fear, would be the muscle. Luca's role was small but essential: driver, decoy, witness. May would be hidden in a nearby safe house curated by a woman Elena trusted from a long-ago kindness. At dusk, the city held its breath. Elena walked into the square with a practiced limp that softened her face and a smile that bled exhaustion into cruelty. Johnny arrived like a storm in a tailored suit, flanked by men who thought brutality was an art form. The handoff was arranged beneath a sculpture that had spent decades watching the city's quiet cruelties. It would now watch a different kind of violence. Luca sat in the van, engine running, the silhouette of the square jagged against the deepening night. His hands clenched the wheel until his knuckles shone white. He could see Elena across the street, a lighthouse in armor, moving with the wild grace of someone who had decided to make herself small for a cause and then could not stop herself from being enormous in consequence. The exchange began with words that meant nothing and gestures that meant everything. Giannis men stepped in with the casual brutality of men who have rehearsed this choreography of despair. Elena made the signing ceremony theatrical and humiliating. Her voice was a blade softened by sorrow as she slid her name across the paper and then, with a quick, practiced motion, looked up and gave the signal she and Luca had agreed upon. It was in that instant, the fraction of a second between a raised hand and a held breath, that the world tilted. Men moved as if in a slow-motion snap. Figures trotted out of alleyways, Elena's loyal ones, unexpected, fierce, appeared from the edges and collided with Giannis men. Shouts cut the night into brilliant, bloody pieces. Luca threw the van into gear and did what he had trained for with trembling hands. He drove into the chaos to create space, to displace bodies, to offer a corridor for May's rescuers. A bullet found air where he had been leaning, and then found his shoulder like a pen finding wet ink. The pain was bright and immediate, a fire that rewrote the map of his body. He tasted copper. He saw Elena stop mid-fight, her face catching his like a net, And then she moved as if the world had narrowed to his breath alone. She ducked beneath a flurry of fists and blades, her hands reaching for him, even while her other hand pushed a man back with a force that made him stumble like a child. "Stay with me," she hissed as someone tried to reel him away. Blood warmed his mouth. May's small voice sounded somewhere distant, safe, hidden, a miracle stitched of stubborn hope. "I won't leave you," he said, and the words were more honest than any ledger. He realized in that moment that the life he had offered to keep small and guarded had found its reason in the fury of standing beside someone who had asked for impossible things. He would not be collateral to anyone's bargains. He would be the man who chose again and again. Elena would have traded everything in that square to keep him upright. When the bullets stilled and Giannis's men retreated into a smoke of defeat and caution, Luca was breathing hard, held in the circle of Elena's arms as her people and the unexpected allies they'd bought with promises, not all of them clean, dragged May out into the open. May ran to him like a compass finding the true north of her world. She was small and fierce and unmarked by the ledger that haunted her uncle's life. Elena watched them, the edges of her face softened by a kind of private, ruined joy. She had expected to buy a different kind of victory. She had not thought she'd learn how to love without the safety of power. When the ambulances came and Giannis's retreat became something accessible and punishable, Luca realized he had been changed in a way that made returning to the old smallness impossible. Elena's hand found his, blood warm where it touched skin, and she did not let go. "You were reckless," she said, voice thin with something that might have been chastisement or prayer. "I was brave," he answered, and the word felt new under his tongue, made of the small miracles of choice. They sat on the curb while May wrapped her arms around Luca's wounded shoulder, and Elena watched the two of them like a woman who had finally been given a glimpse of the ordinary she had thought verboten. Around them, the city's noise restarted, as if the world could not be held away from its work for long. "I will carry the consequences of what I did," Elena said later, when the ledger had been burned, figuratively in the eyes of some, and literally in the minds of others who had seen how dangerous public theater could be. "I will answer for my compromises, but I am tired of being the kind of person who uses others to live. If we are to do this, if we are to create a life, I want it shared." Luca looked at her, at the small scars that had multiplied on her hands, at the vulnerable curve of her jaw. He thought of every quiet midnight he'd spent tallying promises, and of the way love had slipped into his world not like a thief, but like a sacrament. "Then we do it together," he said. "No ledgers, no secrets. If you want a child, then we'll build it from truth and not from bargains." She smiled then, not the dangerous smile that once kept rooms silent, but something softer, almost undone. "You realize what you're saying?" she asked, half laughing. "You are choosing a life that will be messy and loud." "I am choosing you," he corrected. "Messy and loud will be fine." They kissed then, not with the furtive hunger of two people who bargain in shadows, but with the fierce, messy unmaking that follows a shared enemy and a jointly borne wound. In that kiss, there was a promise that had nothing to do with ledgers, to protect not with money but with presence, to make a family that did not carry the debts of others, to build from the rubble they had survived a new ordinary. As dawn bled into the city, Elena and Luca sat holding May between them. The wound in Luca's shoulder ached like an answered question. Elena's hand in his was the map to a future neither had planned. They had paid for safety with risk, for secrecy with exposure. They had bartered pieces of their independence and found, beneath the cost, something undeniably tender. In a world measured in ledgers, They had chosen to open an account that could not be reconciled by numbers. Love as a public act of defiance. A family made by consent instead of transaction. Outside, the rain returned to wash footprints from the pavement. Inside, 3 breaths synced into a rhythm that would become the small, stubborn drumbeat of the life they would now build. Imperfect, dangerous, and fiercely their own. They moved through the months like people learning to speak a new language. There were missteps, silent breakfasts where both rehearsed apologies they couldn't find the courage to voice. Nights when Elena woke with a taste of ledger ink in her mouth, and Luca taught her to breathe out the names of debts until the panic loosened. There were also small miracles. May learning to braid her own hair and offering Elena a clumsy plait as if the woman belonged to their ordinary. Elena teaching May how to make coffee the way she liked it, sugar measured by memory, not by instruction, and laughing when May burned the first batch. The city kept orbiting them, indifferent and relentless, and somewhere beneath the daily grind, a fragile calendar began to fill with new marks that were not payments or ultimatums, but birthdays and doctor's appointments and piano recitals. When Elena announced they would begin the fertility process, it felt less like a plan and more like a pact. They moved together through forms and whispered fears in sterile hallways, hands linked like anchors. Luca learned sterile vocabulary, consent forms printed in tiny fonts, the names of procedures that had once lived in the category of other people's problems. Elena revealed, sometimes in soft, late hours, the ways she'd hidden her loneliness in business meetings and in quiet rooms where candles hid her tremors. Luca revealed, in turn, the little domestic rituals he had tended to his whole life. The way he ironed May's shirts in thin, careful folds. The songs he hummed when storms made the apartment feel too large. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and possibility. On the day the timing was perfect, a calendar circled in Elena's precise hand, they sat in the waiting room, elbows brushing, quiet as pack animals with a single burden. When the doctor left them for a moment alone, Elena reached across and tucked a stray curl behind Luca's ear. He smiled at the small intimacy and felt, in the hollow of his chest, the future arrange itself like a sunrise. There were consequences. Men who felt slighted by public humiliation tested boundaries for a while. But Elena had learned how to thinly veil fury behind an economy of calm. She faced down old debts with documents and with truth, and she paid in ways that left no loose ends. Rusted loyalties closed mouths long enough for new routines to settle. Giannis's threats cooled into grudges, and grudges turned to rumor. It was not peaceful, but it was quieter. When they finally held a positive result in their hands, the paper a small, miraculous lie that said only pregnant but carried whole constellations, Elena wept without armor. Tears slid freely down the face that had been taught to calculate every exposure. Luca laughed until he cried, sound a sudden thing that startled May into giggles and then into a scream of delight so bright it seemed to rearrange the air. They told no one at first. They let the secret live in the hush between them, in the spoonful of midnight pudding shared in the kitchen, in the way Elena's hand rested against the place where a small life would soon make its home. When they told May, she took to the news like a child claiming a new toy. Immediate worship, immediate plans for tiny shoes. The apartment filled with language of smallness, cribs, names, a soft, ridiculous debate over whether the baby would take Luca's stubborn chin or Elena's eyes. Months braided courage and tenderness into routine. Elena taught Luca the art of bargaining for things that did good instead of harm. A pediatrician who'd seen worse and kept no ledgers. A birthing class with a midwife who smelled of lavender and had no patience for dramatized fear. Luca taught Elena how to be ordinary, how to fold laundry in a manner that made it look like a ritual rather than a task, how to listen without calculating the cost of silence. They discovered the extraordinary in the tiny, a name whispered in a half-sleep, a kick that stunned them both into a stunned, careful joy, May insisting the baby would be left-handed like her uncle. In the last weeks before the child arrived, they sat on the fire escape and watched the city trade its afternoon light for neon. Elena traced the map of Lucas' life on the back of his hand, scars from a childhood fall, a small crescent near his thumb from a kitchen accident, like a woman reading a palm and finding treasure. Luca looked at her the way people look at unguarded things and memorized the soft lines at her mouth that had been made by laughter and sorrow alike. The birth itself was neither cinematic nor convenient. It was a frantic night, threaded with hospital lights and breathless nurses, and the ridiculous, tender chaos that lives at the edge of new life. Elena gripped Luca's hand through contractions, her face raw with a wordless fierceness. Luca answered with a steadiness he did not know he could own, whispering the names they had chosen and reminding her to breathe. May's small fingers curled around a plush rabbit in the waiting room, her face a study in vigil. When the baby finally arrived, screaming, alive, the sound of everything that had been promised and risked, the room folded into silence for a heartbeat. The child, warm and indignant and perfect, slid into Elena's arms, and Luca watched as something in both of them rearranged into a quiet gravity. Elena kissed the baby's forehead like a benediction. Luca pressed his cheek to the child's tiny foot as if to stake a claim that had nothing to do with ledgers and everything to do with belonging. Outside the hospital window, dawn was a ribbon of pale gold. The city, with its broken deals and its small mercies, continued. Inside the room, they made a pact not inked in contracts, but in the repetitive murmur of names and promises, that this child would be taught the language of truth, that they would protect without buying safety by stealing someone else's agency, that they would teach her not the weight of a surname, but the weight of gentle courage. Elena rested her forehead against Lucas. He smelled like antiseptic and coffee and 1,000 small nights. She closed her eyes and let herself be ordinary for a moment. No matriarch, no ledger, no blood debt, only a woman who had wanted a single life she could love without reservation. "Welcome home, Luca," whispered to the sleeping infant, voice hoarse with wonder. And somewhere in the tangle of a city that kept its teeth and sometimes its promises, 3 respirations aligned, a child's soft, new rhythm, a mother's even pacing, and a father's steady beat. They were imperfect and dangerous and entirely theirs. The last light of that morning settled on the window like a benediction, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked like something they could keep together.